It gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest lecturer for today, Adam Gopnik. When you think about the people that you know about, but that you don't know personally, whether they're politicians or actors, journalists, or even on a trivial note, professors, it's likely that your knowledge of them comes from a visual medium. TV, film, magazine, or internet. These days, we're likely to have seen someone before we've heard, or God forbid, read them. This often means that the image we have of them based on their appearance, their style, their mannerisms, can overshadow the substance of what they actually have to say, assuming, of course, that they actually have something to say. But some people, even in our visually saturated age, still manage to reach us through words. Since 1986, readers of The New Yorker have come to know a certain writer with the byline Adam Gopnik through a series of essays that blend personal experience with art criticism, literary analysis, philosophy, travel, and history. Most of us had no idea what he looked like. I hadn't even seen a picture of him until a few years ago. And yet, through his chronicles of life in Paris, of raising his children, Luke and Olivia, of losing a goldfish and acquiring a dog, his readers came to know him better than many of their own personal acquaintances. Now, of course, there are plenty of people who share details about their lives with strangers. It's what we used to call blogging. Obviously, that's not what distinguishes Adam Gopnik as a writer. Rather, it's the fact that his writing conjures up in the reader's mind a complete, complex, and compelling person, and then it lets the reader into the innermost sanctum of that person, namely his own mind. To read Adam Gopnik is to experience the thrill of observing the world more closely and thinking more clearly about it. Like Montaigne, an author very dear to his heart, Gopnik reveals to us not only his ideas, but how his ideas take shape in the rough and tumble of everyday life. Why does this matter? Well, students in my ESF section just read Alan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind this week, and this passage in particular stuck out. Quote, "As it now stands, students have powerful images of what a perfect body is and pursue it incessantly. But deprived of literary guidance, they no longer have any image of a perfect soul and hence do not long to have one. By portraying the movements of the soul, Adam Gopnik reveals the rewards afforded by the intense inner life of the mind." The French 18th century naturalist, the Comte de Buffon, himself a great writer, once proclaimed, "Le style, c'est l'homme même." Style is man himself. Whether the Adam Gopnik who emerges from his writings is the man himself is an open question. He would probably dispute it. But the larger point is that his essays are brilliant demonstrations of how you can craft language to express the fullness of your thoughts and feelings. This was one of the two reasons that we invited Adam Gopnik to deliver a lecture in this series. The second reason is that he is one of the most exceptional public speakers that I've ever heard, as I will now let you discover for yourselves. Please join me in welcoming Adam Gopnik.
Thank you, Dan, for that beautiful introduction. As I get older, which I do rapidly, there's nothing that means more to me than feeling that I'm a member of a community of readers and speaking to people who share, not only share common values, because we don't always, but have engaged in a common experience over a long period of time. So that means an enormous amount to me. I should also add that one might dispute that the voice on the page that I offer is like my speaking voice. I don't mean literally, but soulfully. But this is a proposition that my children will strongly refute, that there's anything in common, in fact, between the genial guide you will meet on the page and the irascible old man who you will see every morning. I wanted to talk to you today about a bunch of things. And so the talk I'm going to give you, I will tell you in advance, will seem wildly digressive. It'll seem to be all over the place. But if you'll stick with me, I think we'll come at the end to something that, if it isn't a conclusion that you're going to take away and agree with, will at least be, in the symphonic sense, will be a finale. We'll try and pull together the many themes that I'm going to talk about today. When Dan first invited me to come, I thought that I would give you a lecture on doing things and doubting things, as this title has it. That is, about the whole side of the humanities, if you like, the whole side of what we do when we're in university, what we do when we're studying that has to do with not just with abstract achievement, not just with the kinds of things you can learn in a class and write down and then regurgitate on an exam, which of course I spent a great deal of my life doing and some part of my life sharing as a teacher. But what's come to fascinate me in the last 5 or 6 years is the other easily eclipsed side of the humanities that involves making, that involves doing things. All of those things that involve some strong artisanal ingredient, an act of the hand, learning how to draw, learning how to drive, which is not something I know how to do, believe it or not, learning how to bake, learning how to take care of a dog, learning how to play the piano. There's a whole side of the humanities that, as I say, I think sometimes we too easily overlook, that involves doing things. It involves an element of mastery, that involves some coordination, not just between the eye and the hand, but between the heart and the hand, where we try and make things, master things, simply in order to improve our souls. I'm sure many of the people in this room play the guitar, for instance, or started playing the guitar when you were 12 or 13 years old, as a form not just of self-expression, but it's a form of self-discovery. It's something that's very widespread in our culture. I watched my own son, now 19, just at 14, those genes clicked on and he never let the guitar out of his hand for the next 5 years. Did he do well in guitar studies at school? No, he wasn't allowed to study the guitar at school. He's in college now, and he is studying guitar. Was the accomplishment of mastering the guitar far more significant to him than all the achievements of passing through classes in high school? Yes, infinitely more important. And yet, it seemed to me, and as I watched him do it, that building on the basis of that accomplishment was going to be far more meaningful to him in life than simply going from one achievement to the next that will open the next door to a good university, which in turn will open the next door to law school or whatever. So I became fascinated with this problem of accomplishment, trying to understand accomplishment and where it belonged in the broader universe of the humanities. And I want to talk to you about that today. But before I do, I wanted to talk a little bit about the more kind of pressing journalistic question that's on many people's minds today, and that is, why study the humanities at all? You're all here at this great university. I suspect that most of you, if not all of you, are in one way or another engaged in the study of the humanities. Some of you are English majors, philosophy majors, all of those kinds of things. And I'm sure, who here is a humanities major? Not everybody. Oh, you're freshmen, right. All right, well, you're freshmen. You don't have to choose. Who here will become a humanities major? Some. Not that many. But I'm sure you've discussed this with your parents. I'm sure you discussed it with your friends. Is there any sense in studying the humanities in the 21st century in America? Is that a good use of your time? Is that a good use of your work? Is it a good use of your money, of your parents' money? Those are questions that come up all the time. And the past summer, somebody at the New Yorker magazine where I work asked me to address it. Why should anybody be an English major in 2013? And it was a question that was close to my heart because my own oldest son had just been accepted into college and was thinking of becoming a music major. If there's anything that's even worse than being an English major, it's being a music major in 2013. So I tried to write about it, and I tried to write about why it was that we should study the humanities. What was it? What's the real value of it? Why does it matter in 2013? Now, there are a bunch of models of why it matters, and I was responding actually to one that had been published by the president of Brown University in the New Republic. And in it, she said that the reason we should have the humanities, the reason we should have English majors and philosophy majors and comparative literature majors and music majors is because the kind of training that you get in your mind from having that kind of study actually turns out to be hugely useful when you go off to do real work. That is, if you want to become an entrepreneurial software manufacturer, there's nothing as good for you as having studied English as an undergraduate. It opens your mind, it trains you in ways of thinking, it increases your empathy, it makes you a more a broader person, and therefore the investment we make in humanities studies and English majors and so on is one that gets paid out in surprising ways as we go on. I responded to that by saying this strikes me as what we call a letter to a crazy Republican congressman that every university president has to write sometime or other, defending the kinds of things that go on in the university. And yet, you know, it also seemed to me that it had a particular kind of validity. The man I show you in this slide is Galileo. But it's not the Galileo who you probably have all heard of, the great scientist. This is Galileo's father. And one of the fascinating things that I discovered, I was writing a long essay about Galileo last year, is that Galileo's father, do you see what he's holding in his hand? Is a music paper. Galileo's father was a remarkable musician, not a scientist or a mathematician. He was a musical theorist and a great lute player, one of the greatest lute players in Italy. And what was fascinating about that was exactly that model, which, as I say, we tend to think of as being the sort of thing you try and convince your parents of, or a Republican congressman, that if you study the humanities, you'll actually be a better engineer or entrepreneur. Well, this was true because it was exactly because in Italy in the 16th century, the place where the habits of doubt, the place where the habits of research, the place where you said, here's what I'm doing, can you take it farther, can you make it better, was exactly in music and in music theory. So Galileo's father was involved in a very rich world of dispute, controversy, progressively increasing knowledge, all about the best way to tune a lute, all about the best way to write polyphony. Those were the kinds of arguments that ended up eventually in the well-tempered system that, of course, Bach is famous for. And that was the environment in which Galileo grew up. So in many ways, and here I show you the famous Galileo, the great scientist Galileo, in many ways, Galileo's habits of mind, Galileo's relentless and ceaseless questioning of authority and of the empirical world came out of his exposure to his father's similar pursuits in the world of music. It wasn't that Galileo was educated as a scientist and took it farther. He was educated in the liberal arts and saw that the kind of progressive, questing, inquiring, testing practice that he absorbed in the liberal arts could be extended with considerable courage to the physical world. So there's a nice model at a crucial moment in the history of human consciousness where that's true, where that turns out to be true, that there is something to be said for studying the liberal arts in order to enable you to then found Google. But I don't think any of us are entirely satisfied with that explanation deep inside. We don't just want to study the humanities because they will enable us to make a fortune. They will enable us to do something very different that fills our pockets and makes us matter in the world. There's obviously some value in it that goes deeper. And what I said that I thought the value in it that went deeper was exactly that the habits of talking about the arts, and I was thinking more narrowly about English majors in particular, the habits of talking about the arts are ones that are in some real sense natural to us. One of the things that we cannot help but do is talk to each other in a heated and contested way about the works of art that we love. We see it every morning if, like me, you go on Reddit and go onto the Homeland chat boards. I don't know how many of you do that, right? Is Homeland on the decline? Is it steady? Is it getting worse and worse every day? And what's fascinating is that people like me who would have better things to do, other people who not a whole world of watchers from 12-year-olds to 50-year-olds all get together to argue about that. Our experience of Homeland doesn't end at 10 o'clock on Sunday night. It only begins then. What we watch Homeland for, or Mad Men, or Breaking Bad, or anything else, is for the opportunity to engage in arguments about it with other people. That's one of the crucial parts of having had the experience of any work of art, high, low, or in between, that matters to you, is the immediate opportunity to argue with other people about it. Well, I think this has been true for a very long time, above all, about books. People who like books don't like them in isolation. They like them as part of a social circle. They like to argue about books. Liking books and arguing about books are two activities, like watching Homeland and going on Reddit about Homeland, are two activities that go hand in hand. So then the question is, okay, I see that's, if we abolished every humanities department, if we abolished every English department in the world tomorrow, Would we end people arguing about books? Not a bit of it. People would go on arguing about books. People who like books would go on arguing about books as they do now on the internet, in reading circles, in book clubs. And one of the amazing things in my own experience in the past 20 years has been the growth of book clubs and book circles. They'd go on arguing about it, right? Then you say, okay, so it's a social activity. I see that. That's what it reflects. But why should my parents subsidize it? Why should the society subsidize it? Why should we put public money of one kind or another into it? Why isn't it just something that we do in our living rooms? And the best answer I could come up with to that is one that I feel, I show you Galileo's father and Galileo, now come to a much lower level. I think about my father and myself. The reason that we ought to have the humanities in the universities, why we ought to subsidize them directly and indirectly, is because it democratizes the practice of that conversation. It democratizes the practice of learning. I was thinking of my own father, who was the son of essentially illiterate Jewish butcher in Philadelphia, and had that bug for reading books and arguing about them, ended up going to the University of Pennsylvania at a time when you could actually work your way through college, which you no longer really can. Became an English professor, an expert in 18th century English literature, Johnson, Pope, Swift, and those things, studied for 40 years, and then retired. That life of being somebody who was able to spend his life talking about books and bringing to the conversation about books the insights and understandings that someone who was not in an aristocratic circle, that would not have been available to him if we didn't have the humanities in the university. So the subsidy of the humanities, the place of the humanities in the university, it seems to me, crucially democratizes our practice of conversation, our way of understanding it. And then you can say, okay, but then why is that so important? I see that people have that habit, that practice of conversing. Why should that matter so much? And I think there, the answer I gave in the piece that I wrote was that you never can find a single society of any interest, indeed a single society of any kind, where that practice doesn't go on. Whenever we look, anthropologically or archaeologically, at any civilization or tribe or culture, what we find exactly is that habit of arguing about the cultural objects that matter most to that culture. And I ended up by saying, the reason we need the humanities is because we're human, and that's enough. And I thought that was a nice and ringing, if slightly glib, statement at the end. We need the humanities because we're human. And I still think that's true. But a lot of people have said to me, well, what do you mean by that? In what way do the humanities reflect our humanity? In what way do we need them? Why do we need them? Because we're human. Can you broaden out, explain that in a little more depth, in a little more detail, rather than just as a slogan that we can put on a banner? Can you turn it into an argument that we can understand? And that's what I'm going to try and do this afternoon. That's what I'm going to try and do right now. Now, I warned you that this would be a terribly digressive talk that I hope will come together in the end. And now I will take you on wild digression number one. You will have absolutely no idea why I'm discussing the thing that I'm discussing, but I will show you in the end why it is important to the subject we have at hand. I want to talk to you a little bit about this. This is the Turk. This is the Turk. Anybody ever heard of the Turk? 2 or 3 people here. It's kind of become famous again. It's been rebuilt recently. I'll talk about that in a moment. Turk was an 18th century chess-playing automaton. It was invented in Vienna right around the end of the 18th century, and it was a machine, a robot, that played chess. And for about 30 years, it was one of the wonders of the world. It was invented by a guy named von Komplin, who went around with it. And what he would do is he would open up this cabinet. He would open up this cabinet and show the audience all of this immensely complicated clockwork inside it, which filled up the cabinet so that there was no place for anything but the clockwork. He would close it up, and then he would invite anyone who wanted to come and play chess with this robot dressed as a Turk. I was talking about this once in someone of a Turkish background said, that's not a Turk, that's an Ottoman. So this Ottoman, but he was called the Turk. That was the name given to it at the time. And the arm of the Turk would move in response to whatever was being played. And his arm would move, and he would move pieces on the board in response to the people playing. And he almost never lost. He almost never lost. And he played everyone from Benjamin Franklin to Napoleon in the space of the 30 years when it was intact. And it was one of the wonders of the world, and it was also one of the great intellectual controversies of his time. What was in the Turk? How did the Turk work? Because, of course, there was instantly a debate, an argument, a polemic about whether the Turk was actually a machine or if it was a trick of some kind, if there was a human being who was manipulating the Turk's hands. And this was a debate that came to fill the minds. And here I show you a recent reconstruction of the Turk that was done here in California. The wonderful illusionist John Gagin did it, and it's a perfect reproduction. He shows how Van Kempelen would open the doors and then demonstrate that there was nothing but clockwork inside the machine and so on. And people argued about it endlessly. Edgar Allan Poe wrote a long piece about the Turk and what his theory of how the Turk worked. Maybe the single most significant person to write about the Turk was a man named Richard Babbage. Anyone hear about Babbage? Knows who Babbage is? Sure. Some bright people here. What was Babbage's great act? We think of him as the grandfather of? The computer, exactly. He's the father, really, of the computer, the first difference engine, the first real computer. And Babbage's discovery of the computer came after his reflection on the Turk. Because he said to himself, it can't be that that's actually a chess-playing machine, a chess-playing automaton. We're not sufficiently advanced to have built a chess-playing automaton. That's one of the interesting things about the history of the Turk, is that Babbage, an enormously smart man, was the only one who saw that. People who were saying, well, it must be a machine, didn't make the obvious set of connections to say, well, if there's a chess-playing Turk, there surely should have been a checker-playing Chinese someplace 20 years before. You don't make the leap from nothing to perfection quite that quickly. But it's funny, people didn't see that. Very often when there's somebody proposes a totally new kind of machine, we don't say there had to have been intermediate steps along the way. We just jump right into it. But Babbage said to himself, well, if it were a chess-playing machine, what would it have to be able to do? What kind of machinery would you have to build in order to get a machine to be very skilled at playing chess? And that's the beginning of his thinking about what ends up as modern computing, the work that goes into his difference engine. If you think about it in still one more way, you can see that it's one of the very earliest cases, maybe the first case actually, of what we now think of as the Turing problem. Everyone know a little bit about the Turing problem? The great British mathematician, cryptographer, and one of the more recent fathers of modern computing, asked the question, it's the Turing's predicament, how, if you had a black box between you and a subject, what rule could you invent? What principle could you invent? What program could you invent that could tell you if it was a machine talking to you or an actual human being? And this is something that goes on now in competitions to this very day. It's a very deep problem, and that was exactly the problem that the people of the 18th century were looking at when they looked at the Turk. How would you know if there was a human being inside there or if there was only a machine? And as I say, this became a hugely controversial, much argued over, and difficult problem. Well, I won't delay the kickoff any longer, the payoff, and that is, yes, of course, there was a man inside it. That was the only way the thing could work in 1790. And you can see here in a schematic drawing how the man was hidden inside. Basically, the genius of the thing is that he was on a sliding roller on casters, so he could pull himself up when in this way when the machine was being opened, and then bend forward with a kind of moving stylus and play the game. And that's how it worked. It was a man hidden inside. It's really a classic magician's illusionist cabinet. Now here's the part that I want you to think about, because this is, I think, in some ways the most significant lesson of this whole remarkable story. It's a very good book about it by a man named Stanford, Turk. Here's the thing. The one thing that everybody said who was trying to analyze this Turing problem, was it a man or was it a computer, is if it's a human being inside, the problem is it's got to be somebody who is so small and so good that we would have heard about him before. Right? It's got to be a midget chess master buried in there. Or it's got to be a drug addict. It must be somebody who Van Kempelen has addicted, this is the kinds of things people said, has addicted to opium. Because why else would he stay locked up inside there for so long? Or and this was the worst thing people said, it must be that von Kempelen is raising his own children to be chess-playing monstrosities. And as they get old enough, he inserts them in there, and the poor kids are being brutally exploited like veal calves to play chess. Now, all they've ever done is play chess, and we should break into the machine and rescue von Kempelen's abused and oppressed children. People really said that. But now here's the interesting thing about it. So you think that that makes sense, right? If you're going to have that degree of mastery, and here I show you a slide that shows a little bit more clearly exactly how the damn thing worked. You can see that it was a question of assuming these various positions as the partitions were opened up. So you had the consistent illusion that when he was seated in this way, the player was seated in this way, you could open it up and show that there was, so to speak, nothing but clockwork inside, when in fact he was skillfully hidden. All right, here's the fascinating thing about it. There was no chess-playing genius inside. There was no autistic wonder. There was no drug addict. There was no chess master of any kind. Do you know how von Kempelen made this thing work? He went from town to town, from city to city, in the old world and eventually in the new, because the thing was finally lost in a fire in New York City in the 1820s, yeah. And he would go to chess clubs. He would go to chess clubs, and he would find somebody to play in it. He'd say, who wants a gig being the Turk for a week or 2 weeks? Von Kempelen's insight about modernity, about the nature of modernity, of nature of metropolitan modernity, was that there's much more mastery out there than anybody really credits. That's what he saw. He saw that there were lots and lots of very, very good chess players in Paris and London and Philadelphia and New York at the end of the 18th century, and that it would not be difficult to get them to play. There were so many good chess players, and they were desperate for a gig. They were so desperate for a gig that for relatively little money and in total anonymity, they would sit inside this thing and play. Now, I think that's a fascinating truth, right? That's, for me, is very significant. Because what does it suggest? It suggests that we recognize and value and revere mastery in everything we do. We revere chess masters, right? Just as we revere virtuoso guitarists. But we tend to underestimate how widespread mastery can be in a modern society. We tend always to think that because we know of 2 or 3 or 4 people who play the guitar extraordinarily well, or who play chess brilliantly, that they represent the tip of, not so much the tip of an iceberg, but a special set of people who are uniquely gifted. When in truth, what they represent is a very well-known charismatic set of a much, much, much larger class of people who have mastered the particular thing. Now, why is that interesting? Well, for a couple of reasons, it seems to me. First of all, because it reminds us that we're always looking for beautiful solutions to difficult problems, when in fact, very often the best solution out there is the obvious solution. Lots of people can do it. It isn't as hard as you might think it is. I was telling you, my son is a guitar player. We went to a bat mitzvah the other day, and there was a little jazz band playing, and he said, Dad, do you have any idea how good that guitar player is? And this is a guy who's just gigging around on Saturdays. So mastery is much more widespread. So when we pick somebody out as being particularly good at it, as a master, there's something that we're paying attention to that isn't simply the digital skill, that isn't simply the obvious excellence that they have. Well, this phenomenon of the Turk and the nature, the ambiguities of accomplishment, the mystery of mastery is one that, as I said when I started out, has been haunting me for the last 5 or 6 years. And it's a subject that I've tried to write a series of essays, pieces about in the New Yorker, about how it is, what are the mysteries of mastery? How is it that you go about, even if you have no gift for it at all, achieving some degree of mastery in a difficult artisanal field? How can you do it? Because it's exactly the insight that comes to us from the Turk. It ain't that hard. It ain't that hard. You can beat Napoleon if you're a reasonably good club chess player hidden inside a very impressive apparatus. It's not as hard as we think it is to get to be very good at mastering things, but what are the things that you have to master? And I decided that I would begin this business of trying to master things, master certain accomplishments, from a base of 0 ability and 0 experience. Middle-aged man who cannot hold a pen straight. I've been on a keyboard forever. But I said to myself, what is it that you have to do to go about learning to draw, for instance, learning to learning to play the piano, learning to do magic tricks, learning to bake, learning to cook. What do all of those experiences of artisanal mastery have in common? What do you need to master mastery? So one of the first things I did was to study drawing. Not just any kind of drawing, but classical drawing, what's called life drawing, with an extremely reactionary drawing master in New York, wonderful artist named Jacob Collins. And Jacob is, I'm sure many of you have studied drawing at one time or another in your lives. Has anyone here done some life drawing? 2 or 3 people. Well, most drawing masters I discovered when I went out to learn to draw tend to be extremely admirable, permissive, tolerant, postmodern types who say, express yourself, learn how to do it. There's no wrong mark that you can make. And I was drawn to Jacob Collins because he's an absolute reactionary who thinks that art has been going radically wrong since the 1850s. He despises Manet, he despises Cézanne, he despises everybody except the great academic masters of the past, and he has managed, this is one of the things you can do in big cities, he has managed to recreate a 19th century style atelier in which he teaches you to draw. This is a drawing of Jacob's, and you can see his absolute mastery of that kind of classical style, what he calls traditional realism. But what fascinated me when I began to try and learn how to do this, was that the technique, the pedagogical technique, the learning curve that I had to go up wasn't about paying attention to the visible world as it passed in front of me. In other words, you didn't sit there with a pencil and then just learn to trace an outline. You stopped and thought and made a gray mark. That was of absolutely no use at all. You'd sit there for hours waiting to make a mark. What learning to draw was all about was breaking out, in Jacob's term, of your symbol set and mastering a new symbol set. So this is a drawing I did when I was studying with Jacob. And all of those internal shapes, do you see the one on the man's arm and then again on the leg, are attempts to make the first schematic pass at the proper shading sequences, right, at the pattern of light and shadow that are falling on the body. But the way you learn to do them, because your natural inclination is to draw shapes you already know, right? If you're drawing breasts, you draw 2 big circles. If you're drawing a head, you draw an outsized almond shape. And we tend, because our own internal map of our bodies is very powerful, we tend to overestimate the parts of our bodies that matter to us. So we make our heads way too big instinctively. We make our genitals too large. We move everything out of, we move everything out of plumb. So you have to relearn it. And the way you relearn it is not, as I say, through simple kind of naive observation. The way you relearn it is by finding a new thing to draw, a new shape in the light. So I remember that when I was looking at these, the one down here, Jacob kept saying, can't you see that that shape, that shadow, is like that of a snooty butler? He's sort of looking up with a very long nose. And the one up above is, he said, don't you see that, just think of that as the outline of a South American country. Just think of that as the coastline of a South American country. Don't try and draw the thing that you see in front of you, he was saying. Break out of your expectations, break out of your symbol set into a new set of symbols. Create for yourself a new set of symbols, and you'll be able to start the business of learning to draw. I found that it would be very profound. In other words, I wasn't being told I have to give up my stereotypes, I have to give up my received opinions about the visual world in order to draw. I had to give those up and then take on a whole other set of them, invent a whole new set of stereotypes and cliches, and it was through that movement, through that change, that I would be able to draw better. This, I'm bound to say, is not mine. This is Jacob's as well. But that's exactly what seems to be a general principle of mastery, a general principle of how we master things, is we can never proceed, and I'm sure if anyone's ever studied music, studied the piano, you learn that, right? You learn that what matters is not mastering the whole, it's breaking down the whole into parts that are peculiarly manageable, even if you can't fully explain even if you don't fully grasp that part, and it's through the mastery and the perseverance of the mastery of strange bits that you began to get the totality of it. So that's one thing I think that's very important in understanding, and the same thing is true, by the way, of learning chess. I'm a very bad chess player, but in watching how chess goes on, watching my own kids master chess, one of the fascinating things about it is that it's not a strategic game in the sense you don't learn chess by learning how to get from the first move to the final checkmate. You learn it by learning exactly those kinds of new symbol sets. You learn little routines that you can put into action at any one point in the game, and those little routines, if you can combine enough of them, you learn enough situational moves that you can make, routines that you can make, tactics that work for a situation. They begin to add up into a grasp of the whole universe of chess. That's what the guy in the Turk was doing. So the way we really master things, in other words, is not through their totality and not through a simple patient exercise in observation. It's exactly by mastering strange little symbolic sets, strange little symbolic routines that give us the narrow local confidence that then begins to spread across the page or across the chessboard or across the piano keyboard. That seems to be a general truth in my experience in this adventure in learning about how it is we go about mastering things. But I've left an important part of this out. That is no kind of excuse me, mastery, even of the most artisanal side of the humanities, drawing and piano playing and so on, chess playing. None of that exists in a vacuum. It's always part of an exchange, right? We don't draw essentially for ourselves. We draw to show pictures to other people. We play the piano for an audience. We play chess with an opponent. All of our accomplishments are social in the nature, just as I was saying at the beginning, right? That it's the essence of the humanities to be social. We argue about homeland on Reddit. We don't simply watch in isolation. If we watch in isolation, we're going to end up being one of those people who goes and shoots 20 people unexpectedly. We know that's a form of social pathology, to simply experience any form of art or artisanal activity in isolation. So then how is it that we begin to make the distinctions between the kinds of accomplishment, the kinds of skill, the kinds of mastery that stir us and excite us, and the kinds that leave us flat? Because that's really what we're interested in, right? The mystery of mastery isn't just how we master something, interesting though that is. It's how other people recognize it and say, you're good at that, and I like to hear that, I like to see that, I like to experience what you do. And one of the fascinating things I think you discover when you go out on that search to try and understand not just what are the steps that lead you in the direction of mastery, but what are the steps that lead you in the direction of significant mastery, mastery that stirs and moves other people. If the key to the gaining of mastery is the small symbolic redirection, I think that the key to significant mastery, to expressive mastery, is the power of eloquent imperfection. And I think anywhere you look in the arts, you find that that's an extraordinarily powerful principle. Let me give you an example from one of the most minor, but one of my favorite of all the human arts, and that's magic, the practice of stage magic. Wonderful thing. Something I was lucky enough to get to study in Las Vegas for several weeks a few years ago. Got to spend time with working magicians and illusionists and find out something about what they were doing. A rule, a theory in magic and in illusion is what's called the two perfect trick. The two perfect trick theory. And what does it say, two perfect trick theory? It says no trick, no matter how well executed, will work if it is too perfect. In other words, if I poke a cigarette through a quarter, that's a dumb kind of 12-year-old trick, but let's start there. What's your response going to be to it? Are you going to be in a state of wonder? No, you'll know that there must be a spring, a hole of some kind in the quarter that enables me to poke the cigarette through it, right? So the only way I can sell you that trick, I can make that trick exciting for you, is if I somehow persuade you first that there is no hole there is no swing door in that quarter. And that's generally true about what magicians do. The magician is selling you, not the trick. The magician is trying to get you to go down 4 or 5 different possible logical pathways that could explain the trick, in the hope, not so much in the hope you won't land on the right one, but that the existence of all of the different ones that you could follow will be the experience. In other words, the magician isn't trying to fool your eyes, he's trying to get into your mind. That's what a magician is always trying to do. He's trying to get inside your mind. And it's that exchange that makes magic work. And magicians are incredibly skilled at knowing, in effect, how to mess with our minds, how to mess with our symbol sets. I'll give away one, I'll do one tiny bit of exposure, because it's one that always fascinates me. Well, the greatest living magician, most magicians will tell you, is a Spanish magician named Juan Tamariz. You ever heard of him? He's the Mozart of magic. Amazing guy. Magicians will travel. I once was on a plane with magicians from New York who were going all the way to San Diego just to watch him perform once. And one of the things that Tamariz is famous for is what's called the Tamariz stack. It's a way of putting cards together in an orderly way. And one of the tricks you can do with a Tamariz stack is because the Queen of Hearts is almost always in the Tamariz stack is in the 10th position, right? It's the 10th card as you go down. And if you ask most women to think of their favorite card, many, many women, a majority will say, think of the Queen of Hearts, right? They'll hold that in their head for whatever reason. And it happens to be the fact that there are almost always 10 letters in any name. So if you ask someone, think of a card, don't tell me what it is. Now think of the name of your favorite person and count out that many cards. To a very high degree, it will turn up the Queen of Hearts, right? Purely mechanical, purely mechanical. It's implanted in the stack. But it's not one of the possibilities, right, that we account for cards. We expect cards to be things that you played with. We credit the shuffle. And of course, one of the things you can do is a trick shuffle to make it seem that way. So what the magician is doing, the trick itself is nothing. The trick itself is laid out. It's mechanical. What he's doing is getting inside your mind. What he's doing is enable all of your normal expectations, all of your normal logic trees about how something could be done are totally blown up. And that's what the magician's genius is. It's breaking inside your mind. It's not fooling you with his dexterity. Well, that idea of the too perfect trick, the idea that you have to put the possibility of imperfection into the things you perform, into the things you've mastered, turns out to be an incredibly rich one, incredibly rich. Let me give you an example of just how rich it is. I did a piece, I wrote an essay about an astonishing guy at Princeton named Edgar Choueiri, just came out about a year ago. And Choueiri is genuinely and truly a rocket scientist. Really, rocket scientist. What he does, he builds rocket engines in one of his labs. But in his other lab, he's been working for a long time on trying to create 3D sound, 3D stereo sound, right? Now, you think, well, all stereo sound is 3D, but it really isn't. It's flat. You can hear it coming out of the speakers. He wants a sound that seems to wrap around you, just the way real sound does in the world. We have it very simply in the movies now, right? You put on those stupid glasses and you have 3 dimensions, because your eyes, if you simply place a barrier between your 2 eyes, it's easy to get them separate, much harder to separate what's called the crosstalk cancellation with your ears. And he worked at this and worked at this. He's also an amateur magician, Choueiri. And he remembered the too perfect trick. And he said, what we have to do to make this work is to get people's auditory, if you do it according to the right formula. He figured out a formula for this kind of crosstalk cancellation, so you'd be hearing one thing out of one ear, one thing out of the other. It's very ugly. It sounds terribly tinny and all out. And the only way to fix it was to introduce a lot of error into the signal. That's the way you had to do it. Because what you could basically do is distract people's sense of the timing of an oral cue, of a sound cue arriving. And if you could get them to not pay attention to that and pay attention only to the pitch, you could create the 3-dimensional illusion. And it came right out of his experience of too perfect trick theory. That is, that the way to get a successful illusion is to mess with someone's mind, get them paying attention to the wrong thing in order to feed them the right thing in a way that creates a significant illusion. I know it's a very schematic explanation of a very complicated technical effect, but what I want you to hold on to for the moment is just the idea that through the experience of understanding how a magic trick works, and that is not simply by fooling you, but by getting your mind abuzz, getting your mind awake, he was able to solve this problem of 3-dimensional sound. It's generally true about music, if you think about it, that the strongest expressive devices that we have in music all involve imperfection. They all involve the introduction of human imperfection into a mechanical object. Think about vibrato, right? The way that a note bounces back up and forth. It's exactly adding something that's like vocal imperfection to an instrument that you're playing that creates the effect. That's one of the things we search for, rubato, gentle changes of rhythm within a single phrase. What expressiveness in music almost always is the elegant introduction of apparent error into something that could be perfect in itself, that would seem to be, you'd seem to think what you would want is perfection, absolute mechanical virtuosity, but what we actually have an appetite for is the elegant art of imperfection. That seems to be what people like, for exactly the reason that it works in magic, for exactly the reason that it works in engineering, because it puts us in touch with another mind. We feel in the presence of introduced imperfection that what we're dealing with is exactly not a robot, but that we're actually dealing with another human being. And it's actually very interesting if you study the way that the trick of the Turk was performed, that the handler made sure to introduce enough uncertainty. He would always have Von Kempelen, the guy I was explaining to you, ran the Turk, would always have the machine break down about 2/3 of the way through the game just to introduce that note of uncertainty, right? Is the machine breaking down, or is there a man inside who's suddenly thirsty? In other words, it's exactly by introducing that note of uncertainty that the illusion acquired its effect. All right, why am I going through all this? Because I want to make you pay attention to two things that are essential to accomplishment, to the kind of artisanal accomplishment I've been talking about, but that I think are more broadly true about the kinds of accomplishments that you're going to pursue, that you're going to be interested in. One is, we can never escape from our symbol sets into a world of pure sound, into a world of pure trickery, into a world of pure vision. We always go from one symbol set to another. When Juan Tamariz is doing the stack, he's playing with our expectations about the way decks of cards are organized. He's not simply wowing us with a supernatural seeming trick. When the life drawing teacher is teaching us, he doesn't teach us to look at the body. He teaches us to lose one set of spectacles and put on some other set of spectacles. We can't manage without some set of stereotypes and spectacles and expectations. And the other thing I want you to think about is the incredible power of induced imperfection, the elegant art of imperfection, how much our sense of what makes mastery not just masterful, but interesting, magical, significant to us, is the constant play between the perfection that we seek and the imperfection that we introduce. The piano player we admire is the one who has managed to vocalize the keyboard. It's a very interesting student of the psychology of music named Dan Levitin, who teaches at McGill, is coming actually out to the West Coast to run a new liberal arts college here. And one of the things he's done is to invent an expressive piano into which you can introduce through a computer, again, a deliberate degree of error. In other words, you can have the computer play the piano perfectly, or you can introduce error into it so that it misses microscopically, will miss a note, hold a note, create a pattern of induced imperfection. And invariably, that's the sound that people identify as the best. And that's when, in the Turing machine moment, when they say, that's not a robot playing, that's a human being playing. And that's the moment that they like best. That's a model, I think, of exactly what we really relish in our deepest selves, what really reaches us about the arts and the artisanal. Take it one step deeper, if you will, if you'll allow me one last leap into this field that I've been looking at. Why should that be? Why should we be so drawn to evident signs of imperfection? Why do we so associate that habit, the artful and elegant introduction of imperfection? Why do we associate that with beauty, excellence, wonder? Let me tell you a little anecdote, a little fable that I made up about 2 years ago, and I published. Nobody noticed, so I'm going to try and reintroduce it here. I had in mind I was doing a piece exactly about the Turing machine problem of how it is you know that it's a computer or a person on the other side of a wall, on the other side of a black box. And I got to thinking about a kind of little Twilight Zone episode. Anybody here know the Twilight Zone, or are we totally out of date? You know about the Twilight Zone. Think of a little Twilight Zone episode, right, where a guy is minding an enormous lab filled with computers of all kinds. And suddenly he notices that in all of the output from these computers, that he's suddenly getting things that seem strangely artful and human. They begin to send each other not very endlessly elaborated messages, but very short, compressed, epigrammatic messages. They discover rhyme. They discover sonata form. They discover all the ways in which we abbreviate and compress information to make it striking and moving and significant to other people. And he can't figure out why they're making this leap. Why are these the only computers in the lab who are making this leap? And then he goes into the lab and he opens the computers and realizes that someone has placed a charge of plastic explosives inside each one of these computers on a 70-year fuse, and the computers are aware of it. They know that they don't have unlimited time to do the work of reflection and calculation that they've been invented to do. They know they have very, very limited time in order to do that, and therefore they have to find ways of encoding all of their reflection and calculation and communication in the most memorably compressed ways that they possibly can. Makes sense, right? That would be the way the computer would respond. In other words, the introduction of mortality is exactly the induction of art. The moment you induce mortality, you induce the idea of a short-running fuse, that's exactly the moment when you begin to place an enormous premium on all of the things I've been trying to talk about today, on not just on mastering something, but on mastering something in a way that has the unmistakable signs of a human being behind it. So that's my own little parable of what's there, but I think that that little parable has a real significant moment in it, has some real significance in it. That is to say, when we talk about the humanities, when we talk about our own humanity, when we talk about the practice of the arts, we are not talking exactly about a robotic existence. We are talking inevitably and always about our mortality. That's the true subject, if you like, of any one of the arts and of all of the subjects that we group together as being part of the humanities. They're not exactly the study in things that can go on indefinitely, that have been passed on eternally. It's where I would disagree with Alan Bloom very much. It's not, for me, the continuity of the humanities that's so impressive and moving and at their heart. It's the mortality of the humanities. It's exactly the way in which we have very, very little time to do something, and we have to struggle not just to master something, but to master it in a way that shows that we are aware of the limitations of our own existence as we express it. That's my mom. That's my mom. And I wrote the most recent piece I've written in this series of pieces about the mysteries of mastery. It was about going to learn how to bake with my 80-year-old mother. I'd been eating her bread my entire life, but I never had taken the trouble to sit down with her, spend a weekend learning what it is that's involved in baking bread. And in that action, I just did this essay a couple of weeks ago, there were really two things involved. One was the business of mastering bread, learning how to knead, learning how to churn, learning how long you have to leave flour and water to wait to collect the wild yeasts that live in the corners of the kitchen. But it was also about the necessity of paying a certain kind of overdue homage to my mother's mortality by learning the thing that she had mastered before she was gone. And those two things, the act of learning mastery and the act of respecting the mortality of others, it seems to me that they are fused together in the deepest way in terms of the themes of our culture and the themes of our mythology, but also in the most immediate and practical ways that we can possibly imagine. Here are the boissons, which are my mother's own special invention to the art of baking. It's half a brioche and half a croissant. It would die in a little farm in Canada, where she lives, if it were not passed on as a form of mastery to her children. But the real subject of these boissons, these brioche croissants, when I make them, is not the bread alone, but the persistence of my mother's imagination in myself. So let me then amend for you that thing I said at the end of the piece I wrote about why we need the humanities. I said we need the humanities because we're human. But thinking about it more deeply today, I think the real answer about English majors and French majors, the humanities, is we need the humanities because we won't be human for long. Thank you so much. Now, we have a half hour, I think, for the only part of these things that are really worth anything, and that's taking questions and trying to clarify. I know I've thrown an enormous amount at you. I'd love to try and clarify it for you, but I didn't want to cheat you of stuff. So please, questions of all kinds. Gentlemen here in a, what are you wearing? Is that a Man U jersey?
No, it's Mexico.
Oh, Mexico, all right. I'm a Chelsea fan, I should explain, so I thought that, and I don't have my glasses on, so I thought we might have a Man U supporter here. Right. Not just a musician, although he was, but also a musical theorist.
I was wondering, what would you say was the difference between that mastery in music that caused Galileo to do great things and a mastery in something like math that might have similar controversies in figuring out the best way to do mathematical proofs?
Right. Very good question. What I was trying to say was sort of a little guess. I suspect probably oversimplified, but about the way that Galileo, the amazing thing about Galileo was he's incredibly emboldened, right? He's an impossible guy to intimidate. If you ever read his book on the two world systems, right, his great manifesto, he has no respect for nobody, right? He'll mock the Pope, he'll mock Aristotle, he just has no respect for anybody. And what was striking to me is that habit of mind seemed to me to occur first in what we call the fine arts, in the liberal arts. If you think about Renaissance painting, for instance, in the 15th century, it's very disrespectful. Every painter is trying to outdo the painter before him. In other words, rather than simply passing down an accepted standard, Masaccio does better than Giotto, and Botticelli does better, tries to, than Masaccio and Michelangelo and Raphael show that Botticelli didn't know the first thing about what he was doing. That kind of very ambitious, competitive, contestatory practice, it seems to me, was much more easily available at that time, at that moment, in the liberal arts than it was in what we now think of as the physical sciences and natural philosophy. So I think that Galileo's mind was made, he was taught to dis by having been brought up in that practice. Now, I'm oversimplifying the history of science enormously, but I don't think I'm oversimplifying it lethally. I think that there's something significant in that. And of course, what I was trying to say is that's a model that we all want to sell our parents on, right? We want to say to them, it's okay that I'm an English major, or I was an art history major. That's like beneath anything. I was an art history major, but it's okay because the habits of mind I'll pick up in doing art history will help me when I go to law school. And I was saying, you know what? There's some truth in that, but it doesn't seem good enough. If the reason to be an art history major is because it prepares you for law school, well, probably being in pre-law would probably prepare you even better. We want to defend the humanities on their own grounds. We don't want to defend them just as being instrumental to something else. That's what I was trying to say there. Gentleman here. Speak up. Yes, sir.
Okay, there we go. Does the environment of learning, or the environment, this state of mind, does that make liberal education more effective if you've been exposed to that before, or is it exactly the same if you enter a liberal education or a college education without any sort of experience like that?
I think that obviously we all benefit. You know, the sooner we get the right stuff in our heads, the better off we all are. I have 6 sisters, if you can imagine such a thing. They all have PhDs except for me. One of them is a psychologist, a child psychologist, developmental psychologist at Berkeley, Alison Gopnik. And she is an evangelist for how every child is a little Einstein, and if we treated our babies with sufficient respect, they would be winning Nobel Prizes and so on. So yes, you want to start this as early as you can. But the point I wanted to make is that even if you're coming to university, college for the first time, you're being exposed to what we call the liberal arts, but what you really want to be exposed to, of course you want to learn about the history of Renaissance art. Of course you want to learn to play jazz guitar if you're my kid. Of course you want to learn to read. You want to have read Milton if you're in English. You want to read Proust if you're in Comp Lit, right? But really what you want to learn is the necessity, as I say, of some symbol set, the changing your symbol set so you never get rid of your spectacles You only put them on and off. And I think you want to learn the deep connection between artistic achievement, deliberate imperfection, the art of imperfection, and the idea that all of the arts are rooted in our short stay on Earth. Those are the three things I think we really want to teach beyond the specifics of the skills, if you like. Gentleman here. Let me take one down here, and then go up here. All right, let's do this one. No, let's do you, and then we'll come down here.
So in your defense of the English major, and
Is that on?
oh, sorry.
Speak. I can hear you. I'll repeat it for everybody.
It's for the tape.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry.
In your defense of the English major, and earlier in your talk today, you mentioned how as long as people are interested in talking about books and love talking about books, the English major will die.
No, and not to interrupt you, but just to say, what I probably did say that, but what I meant to say is that the activity wouldn't die. In other words, if we shut down every English department in the country tomorrow, the people who teach English wouldn't then go on to be useful engineers. They would go sit someplace else in a basement and talk about books.
Right, sure. So about a week or a week and a half ago, the New York Times published a piece on the declining humanities in American universities, in particular here at Stanford, and mentioned...
They linked to me, by the way, which was very good, yeah.
Yeah, they had a link to your article, and they said that one thing people are doing at Stanford is trying to, quote, lure kids into English or into the humanities with like computer programs to analyze 18th century literature or patterns in complet, and really find practical implications for studying English. Do you think that defeats the purpose of
Let me answer the question in two ways. It's a very good question. There's no question that one of the richest and most exciting things that's happened in the humanities in the past 25 years is the introduction of practices from the sciences. I was talking about Dan Levitin, the guy who teaches psychoacoustics at McGill, coming here to California now. And what he does is he wants to find out why are we stirred by music? What does music do to our minds that makes it matter? That's a great scientific question. He does scientific research, controlled, peer-reviewed research about what it is that counts. I think that's fantastic. I'll give you another quick example. I've been involved recently in reporting a piece about a couple of guys who have found an Elizabethan dictionary that they think belonged to Shakespeare. And they think it belonged to Shakespeare because there are annotations that show connections between words that are paired in ways that Shakespeare seemed to use. I was astonished to discover that there is now a database called EBO, Elizabethan Books Online. EBO, that has essentially every printed Elizabethan book digitized. So you can check and see, are these connections, are these word connections peculiar to Shakespeare, or are they much more widespread in Elizabethan literature? And you do it, you go on EBO and you press a button. Type in 2 words, you press a button. Tells you an enormous amount about the kind of semantic networks of the Elizabethan mind. Fantastic achievement, right? So yes, as my daughter would say, hearts EBO, hearts that activity. But I don't think we're going to I don't think we're going to do justice to why we want the humanities by scientizing them, by saying, oh, well, they're really just a branch of technology. Because that's not what it's about. The reason that stuff matters is because we care about Shakespeare. The reason Dan Levitin's research on musical perception is interesting is because we care about Mozart. Or because we want to know why is it that we like Mozart more than we like Barry Manilow, I hope, right? So those are the questions. So if we want to address those questions, if we want to find the Mozartness of things, or then we're not going to be able to make them technical. We can't turn them into technical questions. They will remain exactly conversational questions, questions that we can only arrive at by continuing on that conversation about value that has gone on for thousands of years, and that goes on every Monday morning, as I say, on the Reddit boards when we argue about Homeland. I don't mean that as a trivial instance. That's for me. I wake up Monday morning, I have my coffee, and I see what everybody does. Am I the only one who thinks it's terrible? Am I the only one who thinks Carrie cries too much for a CIA agent? Or do a lot of people feel that way? That's what the humanities, that's what we should be doing. That's the core activity that we turn into an elaborate activity. Gentleman here.
So you spoke about the power of eloquent imperfection, and I agree that, like, in many things, what I love about it is that eloquent imperfection. So I'm sort of curious what your thoughts are on why the music industry, and especially the pop culture of music industry, is so fascinated with things like auto-tuning and taking out these imperfections of pitch.
Right. That's a fascinating question, right? It's one I've actually thought about a lot. Everyone heard it? Why? Then, if it's true that one of the things that we like is the eloquent, an elegant introduction of imperfection, why do we have something as bastardized as auto-tuning that enables you to correct pitch and so on so automatically? Two things I'd say to that. One is that we don't really like it. I mean, one of the ways that normal, decent people respond to it is by saying, give me the human voice. Let me hear real music. That's why we listen to Jeff Tweedy or someone who's a real musician, and that's what musicians say. We say, at last, a real musician, Jeff Tweedy rather than Justin Bieber, right? That's one of the things that we say. But think about the way auto-tuning is used. This fascinates me, right? There's invisible auto-tuning, right, which we're not aware of. It's just adjusting pitches behind the scenes, so to speak. But then think of the way we use auto-tuning as an effect. Well, it's exactly like a vibrato, right? What you're signaling to people is this isn't an actual voice. This is sort of halfway between a machine voice and a real voice. And it's in that kind of eerie valley that the really interesting auto-tuning effects go on, right, in hip-hop and so on, right? That you're actually saying, oh my God, that's so weird. You don't say, that sounds right. You say, oh, it's so weird because it goes human, then non-human, then human, then non-human again. So I think even with auto-tuning, its most powerful expressive use is exactly to make you aware of it as being as a form of it, as another electronic form of imperfection. It fascinates me that nobody, when they discovered that you could induce so much auto-tuning that you'd hear it, nobody said, oh, don't do that. They said, that's cool, that's interesting, right? So that I think is part of what's at play there. But it's also to add to it that the judgment we make very often is exactly that the auto-tuned is inferior to the authentic. Yes?
So I think it's a beautiful idea that what we really like about art and music and things like that is the imperfections rather than perfections. But it also seems that, you know, the art and music and writing that we really revere comes from people who absolutely were striving for perfection. You know, that they weren't saying, well, I'm going to introduce a little bit of imperfection into this, and then people were like, you know, these are people who no doubt about it,
That's
we're
right.
trying to be perfect. And that, you know, except for magicians maybe, that the accidental imperfections in pursuit of perfection are what we're looking for. So I'm just curious how you think that people should balance those.
Yeah, yes, I'm sorry if I didn't say that explicitly enough or loudly enough. I thought it was taken for granted. Yes, of course. What we're talking about is meaningful, eloquent imperfection in the context of people who are searching for technical perfection. In other words, what I was trying to say is, given that this is why it's an argument had many homes, but one arc, and that is given that the Turk phenomenon is true, that mastery is much more widespread, technical mastery is much more widespread than we have any idea. And anybody who figures that out, it's true, you know, that's when, you know, it's like small ball in Oakland, right? That's what Billy Beane figured out, right? Mastery is much more widespread than anyone expected. I don't have to pay $12 million for a first baseman. I can find a perfectly good first baseman for $2 million. That was exactly, he had exactly the same insight that the guy who designed the Turk had, right? We overrate famous mastery, we overrate obvious mastery, and we underrate how widespread mastery is. So the point I was making is exactly that in our pursuit of perfection, put that issue to one side, in our pursuit of perfection, which we really do strive to attain, we really want to have, what separates the people we genuinely think of as great, sublime, from those who we merely think of as sloppy, is that very special tension between perfection and imperfection in their work. And I'm sorry if I didn't emphasize enough that, yes, of course, it's the pursuit of perfection that is the enabler of elegant imperfection. And that's, of course, exactly right. And in every one of the artists who we love, it's the back and forth, the tension between those two things, I think, that most often distinguishes it. You know, just coming back to talking about music, right? You guys have been reading Alan Bloom, I gather, in the last bit. One of the things that always strikes me about Alan Bloom is that he could not have been, his argument is very persuasive, right, or seems persuasive, about how utterly important the tradition is for democracy, how important it is for the humanities, in the broad sense, for liberal culture, for liberal humanism. But the funny thing is that the stuff he despised, rock and roll, turned out to be by far the most powerful vehicle of that tradition for people in Eastern Europe. Václav Havel worshipped Lou Reed and Frank Zappa and was essentially completely indifferent to the high tradition in Western music. And one of the reasons he worshipped Václav Havel, the great Czech figure who became the first president of what became the Czech Republic, right? Great dissident, great artist. He loved Frank Zappa and Lou Reed exactly because of their idiosyncrasy, because they represented, in everything they did, an individuality, an imperfection, if you like, that was completely banished in a totalitarian society. So those instances of ornery individuality became far more important than the whole inherited tradition of technical perfection, which you could hear from the Prague Symphony every night. And I think Alan Bloom misses exactly that dimension of what it is that stirs us about other people's example. Lady here. Stand up, shout. We'll get you.
Who do you think appreciates art more, the artist or the masters, or the non-masters, such as the people who cannot produce art or cannot produce music?
I think I would say pugnaciously, unquestionably, the latter. That is, one of the things you discover is that people who are good at something are perpetually dissatisfied with their own performance. Being an artist is a lifetime of frustration, failure, and restarting. Anyone who's complacent about their work is no good at it in that way. So we're the ones who benefit from their misery. And I think that that's a fairly reliable rule of life. Also, we benefit from it, I mean, at a straightforward, common sense way. Magicians don't enjoy doing magic because they know how it works, right? We enjoy it because we don't. What they enjoy is the accomplishment, the skill that they've mastered that enables them to mess with your mind night after night. But they don't enjoy the magic because the magic, one of the rules about magic I learned in my time spent with magicians is the secrets are always insanely stupid. Once you've learned them, they're like the Turk. The Turk's a very good example of that, right? Once you see how it works, you say, that was what bewildered people and fascinated people. It got Richard Babbage to invent the computer, got Edgar Allan Poe to go on laudanum. Said, it's ridiculous. Of course, he's on a chair inside it. The chair's on sliders. What's to be astonished by, right? But it's the totality of the illusion is what stirs us. So no, the audience has the good time, and the artists suffer. Lady here. Can you?
Can we get you to take the mic? I'm sorry, it's just that the team does not pick up people's voices.
So in my ESF class, we talked about the concept of sprezzatura, which roughly translates to effortlessness. And I was wondering why we think we have to cover up our hard work, and is it because we want to project this sense of we're talented rather than hardworking?
Yes, did everyone hear the question about sprezzatura? Of course, this is one of the great Renaissance aesthetic terms that involves the apparent ease with which you do something. It's Fred Astaire dancing, right? Has enormous sprezzatura. He doesn't seem to be working very hard. And we tend to value not just artists, but people generally, who seem to do with ease what we all have to do with effort, with enormous effort, and we prefer the easy artist, as a rule, to the obviously effortful one. There are exceptions to that. I think it speaks to exactly what I've been trying to talk about this afternoon. That is, what we're engaged in when we're admiring someone's performance isn't just the technical perfection with which they do it. We're engaged in a mind meld. We're engaged in a mind meld with that person. And if that person has the kind of mind that enables him or her to do something with great ease, we want to be inside that mind. We want to understand it. We want to meld with that kind of mind in a way that we don't want to meld, necessarily, with someone who seems to us robotic, somebody who seems to us like a zombie of performance. And I think it's exactly that same thing that explains why that sprezzatura, that ease, is so universally appealing. We recognize that as one of the crucial signs of mastery. It's not unrelated. Sprezzatura and vibrato are related things. In other words, there are also ways of signaling to us about the nature of the mind that's making the mastery. And that interests us as much as the mastery itself. Exactly.
Want to pick someone?
Someone here? Lady here?
So I have a question that kind of leads on from that one. So I really liked how you said that anyone can beat Napoleon if you're a reasonably good chess player within a beautiful apparatus. And I was just wondering if you think that each of us can find this beautiful apparatus or this unique charisma. Can we all be masters of an art?
Well, what a beautiful question. Yes, I mean, I think what's fascinating about the Turk, right, as I said, many things are fascinating about the Turk. That it's the first Turing test, that it's that something so simple enraptures minds. But one of the things interesting is that once you know the secret, which isn't the secret about the chair, it's the secret about going to the chess clubs and saying, who wants to be the Turk for the next week, is you ask yourself, well, then how could he always win? Now, there are two things going on. How could he always win? The guy playing the thing was always changing, and though it was very good sequence of very good chess players, it was not the greatest chess player in the world. The greatest chess player in the world had his own gigs, right? Didn't have to do this. And I think one of the things that's interesting is there are two things probably involved. One is a reporting phenomenon, right? The Turk probably lost a lot, but nobody remembers when the Turk lost, right? It's when the Turk beat somebody famous that it got into the newspapers. That's one thing. The other thing is I think that the apparatus played an enormous role in the success of the machine. It had not a placebo effect, but a kind of costume effect, right? People froze because they didn't know what the hell they were playing, right? Machine, man, what was it, right? And that's very disconcerting. You know, that's really kind of puts us off. It's one of the ways that good football coaches are able to get an edge in a game, right? Is to put in a play that you haven't seen before. You don't know which way it's going, and so on. So I think that's part of it. To your deeper question, do all of us have it? I think all of us are in search of it. I think all of us are in search of it. You know, in writing, as a writer, it's exactly we search for the truth, we search for authenticity, we search for sincerity, which is a very important thing. It's out of date, but sincerity is terribly important, saying what you actually believe. But we also search for the beautiful apparatus. In writing, we call it a voice. We call it a voice. And it's an endless struggle to find your voice, and then to keep your voice, and then to adjust your voice. And every writer I know, without exception, remembers of skill and accomplishment, remembers the moment when they first found their voice, when something went down on the page, not so much that sounded like them, but that sounded the way they wanted to sound. You know, it's like, I have a good friend, wonderful writer named Luke Manan. And he always says when he's writing badly, and suddenly Luke clicks in, right? And then he writes well. The ancients thought of that as the demon, right, that sits inside our heads. So yes, I think we're all in search of that beautiful apparatus. It's an endless search. It's an inconclusive search because one man's beautiful apparatus is the next man's hideous disguise. But that's, I think, exactly what we're after. And exactly what I'd say is that our search for mastery, our search for technical excellence, and our search for the beautiful apparatus are inescapably joined in our attempts to move our fellow man and woman. Someone else over here.
This is good because I need exercise.
So you mentioned that one of the purposes of studying the humanities is to preserve some of the things that humanity has mastered. So are there some things that we are aesthetically or morally obligated not to preserve? And by what standards do we know that this is something that should be passed on?
Does anyone hear the question? What about the stuff we shouldn't pass on? And we think of lots of things. You know, that's always one of the things I often like to think of. This isn't specifically related to mastery, but it's a more general moral question. Is we know when we look back and you're studying 19th century history, and you say to yourself, how could anybody have tolerated the idea of slavery for a moment, much less how otherwise seemingly humane people like Thomas Jefferson, how could they have tolerated it for a minute? How could you have had a society in which women weren't allowed to vote? And when John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor wrote their great essay on the subjection of women, people didn't say, oh, yeah, obviously, right? They all said, oh, my God, can you believe such a radical idea? It's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard of. And we say, how could people be so morally blind? How could people be so morally blind? But the question that I always try and ask myself is, what are we equally morally blind about? What is the thing that we do routinely and without thinking about it that our descendants will say, how could those otherwise seemingly good, educated people have been so morally blind to? And that's a really interesting question, right? That's the good question, right? Because we can always feel superior to the past, right? But in what way is the past going to feel superior to us? That's an interesting one. And I suspect, and you can begin to think of things that they will feel that way about, because we've already seen a few in our own time, in my own lifetime. The one, for instance, I've seen in my own lifetime is about concussions, about boxing. My grandfather was a boxer. My father loved boxing. I used to go with him to see boxing. Now I can't watch it anymore, and I think that's a general moral intuition that's spread throughout our society, that the whole business of having a sport in which two men try to give each other concussions that will lead to permanent early onset Parkinson's. This is not a good sport. I think we don't need this sport. And I suspect that that will pass along to football, much though I love football in all of its kinds. So there are ways in which I think also I suspect that our descendants will be as sickened by our eating veal chops as we are by our ancestors keeping slaves. Or if not as sickened, but they'll certainly be morally appalled that we would engage in that kind of mass cruelty to feeling creatures. So I think that that kind of moral inquiry is always going on. When it comes to the arts, it's a little more complicated when it comes to the arts and the humanities because there's clearly things that we don't want to perpetuate, right? We don't want to perpetuate any kind of art that depends on inflicting cruelty on people. One of the spookiest recordings I know is a recording of the last castrato, the last singer in Rome who had been castrated as a 12-year-old in order to keep his voice high, right? And that was a routine, accepted, smiled on activity for hundreds and hundreds of years because you got beautiful voices and then they were well cared for. Who cared? And at the beginning of the end of the 19th century, there was still someone left. It's an eerie sound, I will warn you, that goes on, right? So we don't want to have castrati. We probably don't want to have castrati singing, right? That seems cruel to us because we also think 12-year-olds can't really make a good decision about whether they want to keep their testicles or not. They're not, if they're under too much pressure to make those good decisions. But there's another deeper question, right? That's a relatively easy one, those kinds of questions. Foot binding, right? The bound foot may look beautiful, but we don't want to play. We'll have to deal without that kind of beauty in order to have women with healthy feet. Deeper questions are about areas of symbolism and content. Anti-Semitic literature, Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. No way you can waltz around the fact that there's powerful anti-Semitic content in that play. The early movies of D.W. Griffith. No way you can waltz around the fact that, brilliant though they are, they're profoundly racist and so on. They begin to raise questions that those are the ultimate contested questions, it seems to me. And about all I can say, and I recognize that it's a fairly namby-pamby conclusion, is that of all the arguments we have about art, those are the most vital and urgent and the ones we can't easily dismiss through the invocation of aestheticism, which I think Alan Bloom does sometimes. So, well, we love Merchant of Venice because it isn't anti-Semitic truly because it's a great play. No, it's a great play and it's truly anti-Semitic. Of all those things, those are the things you can't solve on the Reddit board on Monday morning. Those are why institutions like this one exist, to argue those questions.
This is going to have to be our last question.
Yes. Okay. So if the practice of embracing new symbols and new perspectives is the key to mastery of mastery, then which is more valuable and useful for this mastery of mastery? Trying to learn lots of new symbols in one thing, like new chess moves, or trying to get a smattering in a bunch of different fields that have completely different symbols?
It's a very good question to end with. Everyone heard it. Which is more important, right? Well, the answer is we've constructed two different institutions in which to take care of both, right? We have music schools, fine arts academies, in which we try chess academies, though I would hate to see anybody devoting their life to chess, but that's me. To where what we do is we focus on one. And the point is, even when you're only focusing on one, as in fine arts, the point I was trying to make is what happens is not, oh, you get progressively, incrementally better and better. What happens is that you're constantly learning new routines, you're putting on new spectacles, expanding and altering those symbol sets in order to get a greater kind of mastery, right? It's not that everybody gets incrementally better at playing chess just by playing chess. You have to learn sets of routines that will enable you to master a particular situation, which leads you on to the next one. Studying life drawing, you don't just look at more nude bodies and get better. That's not how it works, right? You learn to spot in the play of shadow and light on a particular body, the edge of an African nation, the look of a snooty butler, and having learned that activity, you then go on to all the fine point activities, and you learn that cross-hatching, for instance, is something that can be more eloquent and smudged than detailed and so on. The eloquence of the eraser is a part of drawing, so on, right? So we have those kinds of institutions. Then we have institutions like this one. We have institutions like this one where the premise is that learning a lot of those things will benefit you in the long run. I am by nature training and inclination inclined to think that this is the right kind of institution. Because exactly what it makes you aware of is the endless transit of dialogue amongst all those kinds of activities. It makes you aware that what you're doing when you're learning to bake bread and what you're doing when you're learning to draw a nude body are remarkably similar, that all of those things come together. They're not the same, and one of the great costs of getting that knowledge is you'll never be insanely good at any one of them, right? That's built into it. I was seeing a wonderful dancer from Canada who was in New York the other day, and I mentioned that we had a friend who was 14, wanted to take up dance now, really wanted to do that. And he shook his head and said, she's far too old. She's much too old. You have to start at 7 or you'll never be any good, which is what he had done, right? So we pay an enormous price for that kind of mastery in our lives, as anyone knows who's ever danced or played a musical instrument seriously, and so on. But what you get from seeing the transitive relations of all of the humanities, from seeing the repetition of common pattern of seeking, common ways of seeking in liberal arts, is, I think, finally, and that's what I was trying to say today, the deepest kind of recognition you can get of what it means to be a human being, which means being someone who knows that she has a charge inside them that is going to explode sometime soon, in your case far off, but still eventually, right? And who has to make sense of the time that we're given in a way that's meaningful to the people, the machines, the computers, the Turks, the others who are going to come after us. That's what our job is in life. And it seems to me that the humanities realize that work better than any other, the broad spread of the study of the humanities better than any other study I know. Thank you for coming. Thank you for listening.